My name is Phil Gurski. I spent 32 years working in intelligence here in Canada, both with Communications Security Establishment, CSIS, and with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, where I was a specialist in counter-terrorism. And I'm also, since my retirement from CSIS in 2015, I have authored 6 books on terrorism and spoken on the phenomenon internationally and in hundreds of countries around the world and given thousands of presentations on it. The purpose of today's talk is not to limit myself to terrorism per se, but to weigh in on what's been happening in Canada over the past 6 to 8 months. I'm speaking, of course, of demonstrations in Canadian cities, blocking of streets, occupation of university campuses in reaction to the Israeli Defense Force action in the Gaza Strip, the so-called war against Hamas in Palestine. And I know it's dividing a lot of Canadians who are on either side of the conversation. But I think it's important to lay some context into this particular, what we're seeing now here in Canada. Bottom line is, and I can't put it more succinctly than this, the only reason Israel is in Gaza right now with its armed forces, engaged in battle against Hamas, and unfortunately resulting in the deaths of civilians, which happens in wartime. It's not a great thing, but it's a consequence of war, is because of what Hamas did on October the 7th of last year. So to remind you, Hamas terrorists. Hamas is a listed terrorist entity here in Canada, as well as in many countries around the world, launched a cowardly, heinous attack in southern Israel that resulted in the deaths of 1,200 Israelis, the rape, mutilation, sexual mutilation, and killing of women, particularly, which was bragged about by Hamas warriors, so-called warriors, and filmed on their cell phones, as well as the taking of hostages. As a consequence of this attack, which per capita was actually greater than the 9/11 attack was in the United States from an Israeli perspective, the Israeli government decided to go in and eliminate Hamas as a threat to Israeli national security. That's why Israel is there. Now, there's no question that mistakes have been made in terms of bombing campaigns, in case of drone strikes, etc. And as I said, civilian casualties are an unfortunate sidebar of modern warfare, of all warfare actually, historically. But what worries me today is that what we're seeing here in Canada is very much a one-sided story. So first and foremost, these occupations of campuses seem to be doing a couple of things. One is that they see Israel as the only partner at fault. And as I alluded to, this war was caused solely, only, by the fact that Hamas decided to launch a terrorist attack against Israel on October the 7th, 2023. Secondly, we have this movement in Canada that sees Hamas, a listed terrorist entity under Canadian law, as some kind of heroic fighting force, a resistance movement, or freedom fighters. And that is completely contrary to what the Canadian government has decided when it lists them as a terrorist entity. Thirdly, and more importantly for this conversation, is the movement of criticism of Israel and to a criticism of what they call Zionism, and then more critically, a criticism of Jews in general. So the people that support what's the Palestinian people and their desire for a homeland and want the war to stop are actually supporting, to a certain extent, a vile anti-Semitic campaign. If you listen to the slogans that are being raised by the protesters, the most common one is, Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea. What does that even mean? What this means is that the existence of a free Palestinian state, which I personally support Palestine as an independent state, would entitle, or would engender rather, the elimination of Israel as a state, because the river in question is the Jordan River and the sea in question is the Mediterranean Sea. So if Palestine is to be free from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that means the elimination of the state of Israel. That means the elimination of however many millions of people live in Israel. The Israeli state's been around since 1948. I think what worries me as a former practitioner in intelligence, and more narrowly as a counter-terrorism specialist, is we have a number of Canadians that seem to have no problem with supporting, again, a listed terrorist entity in Hamas, as well as we've seen flags for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, also a listed terrorist entity in Canada, and even some Hezbollah flags. Hezbollah is also a listed terrorist entity in Canada, that they see these people as somehow fighting the good fight against their Israeli oppressors, colonialists, settlers, whatever term you want to use. Bottom line is that any support for Hamas, PIJ, or Hezbollah is support for terrorism and is a criminal offense under the Canadian Criminal Code. I think more worryingly is the growth in anti-Semitism here in Canada. So what we've seen, anti-Semitism is something which we, as a human species, have been faced with for thousands of years. Unfortunately, some of these protesters are taking their fight not just to the state of Israel and to institutions, getting them to divest in the Israeli economy, not support the Israeli military, a lot of demands for Canada to cease relations with Israel. They're now attacking Jewish targets that have nothing to do with the state of Israel, such as synagogues, such as Jewish schools. And if I could draw an analogy here, as somebody who worked on Islamist extremism for 15 years and I've written 6 books on the topic, this is the equivalent of blaming all Muslims for 9/11. Saying that if you're Muslim, you are inherently responsible for the deaths of 3,000 Americans and you should be punished for it. That's exactly what these protesters are doing, and these people that decide to deface synagogues, to firebomb schools, etc., is they're equating the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces with the entirety of the Jewish Canadian population. These crimes, at a minimum, are hate crimes. There are criminal code provisions against hate crimes. Sections 318 and 319 in the criminal code define what hate crime is and define punishments for it. And what worries me is that people don't seem to see this. They don't see these as hate crimes because of what's happening in Gaza. There's a lot of emotion involved, and I get that. But if we're ever to be a nation that is governed by law, a nation that's governed by rules, we have to ensure that those rules are enforced. Now, I know it's difficult for law enforcement in dealing with these situations because of the aforementioned emotional level involved, but a law is a law, and if there's a contravention of that law, arrests have to be made and charges have to be laid. Hate crimes are sometimes difficult to establish. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have a right to freedom of speech. We have a right to protest. So it's often a gray zone between what constitutes a legitimate right to protest and engaging in hate speech. So I'm not saying this is simple, but to me, there are many instances that I have seen in open source media, I don't have access to intelligence anymore, that point to the fact that we are dealing with hate crimes. Moving on, I think what is very disappointing is that the current government in power, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau, don't seem to get this. They have played the middle road on this, trying to recognize both sides, very Canadian of them, by the way, and they're not recognizing the hate crimes for what they are. And in essence, what they're allowing is a small number of people who have violence in mind, whether it's violence in the case of firebombings or torching of synagogues. We've seen arrests made in Canada of individuals planning attacks on synagogues and schools, some of whom may be in fact associated with Islamic State or ISIS, which has made it quite clear in its propaganda since October the 7th that it is expecting people in the West to attack Jewish targets, not Israeli targets, but Jewish targets. And the government doesn't seem to understand what is going on here. And that's very disappointing from a Canadian perspective. Hate crime is hate crime. Terrorism is terrorism. And I think the laws have to be enacted in that way. We are seeing a spike in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as I alluded earlier, is this beast that never seems to go away. But ever since the events of last October, there seems to have been a growing, on the part of some people in Canadian society, a growing acceptance that anti-Semitism is okay. Not just okay, but required to allow the Palestinians to have their rights recognized and for the war in Gaza to end. We all agree that wars are never a good thing. And I personally hope the war ends sooner rather than later. But that does not entitle you to extend your desire for an end to the war, to start targeting your neighbors, your communities, because they happen to be Jewish, and you're drawing a link between being Jewish and the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces and Air Force, Army, etc., in the Gaza Strip. The two are not the same. And it is absolutely mandatory that those who have legitimate concerns about civilian casualties in Gaza make that distinction, focus their attention on what they see as the actions of the Israeli government, and not the thoughts, adherences, allegiances, or whatever of average Jewish Canadians. I think as Canadians, we cherish the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We recognize the right to assembly. We recognize the right to freedom of speech, freedom of thought. But when that crosses the line into very blatant anti-Semitic statements or anti-Semitic acts, these have to be stopped, and they have to be stopped immediately. So I'm hoping that this gives you some kind of context into what we're dealing with here in Canada. I cannot imagine how busy my former colleagues at CSIS are these days with this particular phenomenon, as well as my friends at the RCMP and provincial and municipal police forces dealing with crowds, dealing with occupations on university campuses, dealing with protesters. But it's important for us as Canadians to demand And one vehicle of doing so is through this petition that the government take appropriate action and urgent action to say anti-Semitism is not acceptable. Those that engage in speech that constitutes hate speech under the Canadian Criminal Code will be taken into account, and where there's enough evidence to warrant, they will be arrested and charged under the Canadian Criminal Code. This is not what it means to be Canadian. We are people of fairness, we are welcoming people, we are people that try to see many sides of an issue, but in this case, we're talking about very simple hate, anti-Semitism, and sort of to the nth degree, the possibility of acts of terrorism carried out by people against Jewish communities in the name of groups such as Islamic State. So I hope this has given you some kind of context to help support this petition and send a very clear message to the government that these activities are un-Canadian, they should not be accepted, and we expect the government to take action on these issues.